what I believe the Lord is talking to us about. But I've entitled this lesson, A Sharper Focus. I think Peter is calling us to that in chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. But by way of introduction, I want you to focus on this. Listen and look at it. Mind is the master power that molds and makes, and we are mind. And evermore we take the tool of thought and shaping what we will, bring forth 1,000 joys, 1,000 ills. We think in secret and it comes to pass. Our world is but a looking glass. James Allen, 1903, there's a picture of that dude, handsome rascal, as he wrote this. I don't think, I'm guessing that it's unlikely that any of you here know the author of those words, Mr. Allen, who passed from this earthly life in 1912. You likely don't recognize his name because he never became one of the so-called literary rock stars.
Did you go to the funeral? No,
I didn't. Bill was a contemporary. So he was a decent sort. Sort of. He wrote an obscure book some 115 years ago entitled As a Man Thinketh. As a Man Thinketh. Published in 1903. By the way, it is available now. If you're interested in reading this rather small book, you can get it you can Google it, you can get it on Amazon, you can get it on Barnes & Noble. I understand you can get it in Walmart, although they're charging $20 for it, but you can get it elsewhere for $8 or under, sort of thing. And one short biography on him suggests that he was something of a literary mystery man, yet his inspirational writings have influenced millions of people for good, by and large. Still today remains relatively unknown. None of his 19 books that he wrote give a clue of his life, other than to mention that his place of residence, which was in England. Now, he lived for 47 short years, died virtually unknown. But what is true is that many other motivational rock stars, if you will, that's my terminology, have stood on his obscure shoulders over the years. And by that I mean people like, and I want to see if you can recognize some of these people that have been influenced by Mr. Allen's writings and original thought. Anyone know who that might be? Take a guess. It's Bobby's brother-in-law. I just wanted to get him some notice. That's Dale Carnegie. Remember him? Anybody know about him?
Yeah.
Life magazine.
Yeah, he founded the How to Win Friends and
Influence People.
Right. That was a training program that has shaped the lives of millions of Americans over the last 100 years. He lived for 66 years. How about this one? Anyone know about him?
Bishop Fulton J. Sheen.
Sheen, that's right, Bishop Fulton Sheen. And he was another star who stood on Brother Allen's shoulders. Maybe you don't recognize the name, but he was a Roman Catholic bishop who was the most popular television figure back in the 1950s. Each week, millions and millions of people listened to and watched Bishop Sheen because of the incredible way that he was able to speak and to motivate people. Now, how about this one? Norman Vincent Peale, author of The Power of Positive Thinking, right? Or how about this guy? I've met this guy myself. Whoops, get out of there, Robert. This guy there, you can't see him, but him. Now, who is he? Everybody ought to know him.
Looks like, yeah.
That's Zig Ziglar.
Oh, that's Zig Ziglar.
Yeah, one of the greatest salesmen
I know,
in
yeah.
the...
I've read some of his books.
Yeah. That See You at the Top is one of his books. one of the world's greatest salesmen, 86 years old. One of the great quotes that I like about him that influences me is he said, if you go out to find a friend, you're going to find they're very scarce. But if you go out to be a friend, you'll find them everywhere. Good advice for us. Or how about, and I didn't know until I did a little bit of research, I didn't know much about Louise Hay, Hay. She wrote a very influential book, and millions of women have listened to her, and the title of one of her most famous was, You Can Heal Your Life. And so she wrote, and all of these have built their works and their message off of this obscure Mr. Allen of 1903. And a couple more. Anybody know who that is?
That's the Crystal Palace guy.
Yeah. That's Robert Schuller.
Yeah.
Tough times never last, but tough people do, was his byline that he wrote. Now,
Wonder if he still has that applying to his life.
I don't know. I don't think so. How about him?
Oh, no.
Joel Osteen.
What'd you put him up here for?
Just by contrast.
Mm.
Your best life now? I don't misunderstand me. I'm not necessarily endorsing any of these people. And I'm not intending to criticize their work, except perhaps for the last
I
one.
was gonna say, go
And by the way, you know he's not in ministry anymore.
No.
Yeah.
He resigned his church so that he could go into his wife's cosmetic skin care line and build an empire.
Well, did you see where originally they did not open their church to the?
No.
But they are now.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, after they got all over the.
Did tap in to an important biblical truth that James Allen originally surfaced. And that was my point of trying to bring these out. Namely, that's this, that what you allowed to listen, please listen closely, because I may mumble. And that's this, that what you and I allow to go into our mind, how you and I choose to think, has an undeniably powerful effect on what happens in our life. What you put in is going to impact what comes out.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Garbage in, garbage out.
I told a young man that this week. I didn't want to take away from your thing.
Please, please.
But he's one of our janitors at school, and he's a very nice young man. And he's actually helped us with a lot of our problem little boys, because a lot of our boys don't have father figures in the home and stuff. And one of our little boys was singing, and they're 4. My children this year are 4. Was singing an awful rap song, you know, and he was singing it at the lunch table. And this young man went over and said, "You shouldn't be singing that in here." And he said, "But that," the little guy said, "That's stuck in my head." And then he responded to him. He said, "Yeah, I was listening to that this morning too, and it really stuck in my head, and I've been hearing that over and over." And when he sat down next to me, I said, "You know, David," I said, "I'll tell you what Mama used to tell me, garbage in, garbage out." And his face just fell. He said, "You're right."
Yeah, amen. It is amazing how that works. I'm sure each of you have similar examples. A couple of years ago down at the gym, Don, maybe it was when you and I, it goes back as far as you and I were still playing.
A long time ago.
That was a long time ago. But in the locker next to mine, somebody had left their cell phone, which is not unusual, but his ringtone was Feliz Navidad. You know that song? Feliz Navidad. You know, that sort of thing. And somebody really wanted to get them. And they called and called the whole time I was there. For a week.
Oh, no.
For a week. Feliz Navidad. You know, and I couldn't get it out. And that'll happen. And so this is an original thought that Brother Allen, I shouldn't call him brother, Mr. Allen, I don't know whether he's a brother or not, but Mr. Allen brought forth. So what, and it's important, and Peter reiterates this, and Scripture over and over says it, in different ways, but what you and I allow to go into our mind. Now just think about that for a moment, the basic premise of that. I was going to bring this statistic, maybe I'll bring it next week, but I was reading through Christianity Today. Any of you ever read that magazine, Christianity Today? Your pastor probably. And in it, it's a relatively short article, but it says, in the church, in the Christian church today in America, 68, it's estimated that 68% of the men are addicted to pornography.
Right.
68, Norm and I were just briefly talking about it, that there is this issue in the American church. I certainly know and accept. I've done enough counseling to know that. Sorry, ma'am. But the 68%, that blows my mind. That's what? That's 2 out of 3?
Yeah, basically.
Basically, 2 out of 3. Now that's staggering. And so again, the point is what you and I allow to go into our mind from whatever source, you know, affects how we choose to think, and that has that most powerful effect on what happens in our lives. Now that's why, you know, just another reason why pastor and your leadership is always saying, get in the Word, get in the Word, get in the Word. You know, by the washing of the water of the Word. And, all right, let's go on. Here's a little more of what James Allen has to say. He says, and I'm quoting, the aphorism, quote, as we think in our hearts, so are we, which, by the way, he borrowed from where? Huh?
Psalm.
Proverbs.
Proverbs.
As we think in our hearts, so are we. Proverbs 23, verse 7, if you want to look that up. Not only embraces the whole of our being, but it is so comprehensive as to reach out to every condition and circumstance in our lives. We are literally what we think. Grab that. We are literally what we think. I want to do more on that perhaps later in another series, but we are what we think. We are literally what we think. Our character, listen, and I'm quoting, our character being the complete sum of all of our thoughts. Our character being the complete sum of all of our thoughts. He goes on. Your mind may be likened to a garden that may be intelligently cultivated or allowed to run wild. But whether cultivated or neglected, it must and will bring forth. If no useful seeds are put into it, then an abundance of useless weed seeds will fall therein and will continue to produce their kind. Has anyone seen that to be true?
Oh, sure.
It's true.
Sure.
You know, you can dig up a garden patch and just leave it barren, and it's not going to grow tomatoes, you know, or corn. It's going to grow all kinds of weeds. And then he goes on, and he says, just as gardeners cultivate their plots, keeping them free from weeds and growing the flowers and fruits they desire, so may you tend the garden of your mind, weeding out all of the wrong, useless, and impure thoughts, and cultivating toward perfection the flowers and fruits of right, useful, and pure thoughts. Now, my question for us this morning is that true?
Yes.
Is that true? Now, just because we read something that's in print, or we read something published on the internet, we see something presented on TV, that doesn't necessarily make it true, does it? Does it?
No.
No.
Mr. Trump.
So is it true, as James Allen has written, that what goes on in my life, listen, what goes on in my life largely depends upon what I cultivate in my mind? Is that right? I think so.
Is the mind and the heart here, for out of the heart proceed the issues of life.
Right.
The scripture tells us.
Yep. Now, before we accept or reject that idea, let's set our eyes on 1 Peter 4, 1 and 2. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. Now, I'd like us to, excuse me, I would like us to study the first 11 verses of this chapter, if we can this morning, and I want to ask the question, so what is this portion of God's Word teaching us about living? And I want to submit to you that it's simply this key idea. You want to keep it with your notes. Exceptional disciples. You've heard me use that term over and over and over again. Exceptional disciples. That is, people who want to live for Jesus Christ in an exceptional way. You know, there are many, many, many Christians sitting in the pew out there here in less than an hour that are saved as if by fire, that have fire insurance. You know those kind of jokey terminology. They're perhaps saved, but that's as far as they've ever gone with their Christian growth. And they'll make their obligatory appearance at church, and I'll talk about this in later lessons, but maybe a couple of times a month. That's not an exceptional disciple. I would plant most of you in that definition as exceptional disciple, that you're really interested in living for Jesus Christ in an exceptional way. So exceptional disciples prepare what they think in order to prioritize how we live. That makes sense? We prepare what we think. Okay? We prepare what we dwell on. On that 3 seconds, men, you have between one honeydew and another honeydew. What you dwell on. That is definitely not my life. Norma is very, very careful to allow me 6 seconds.
So that's plenty of time to dwell on honey.
That's right. There you go. Not bad. I like that.
That was good.
So let me just hit that again, because that's the thing that I think we see here, and I want me and us to walk away with, and that is exceptional disciples, those who truly want to live for the Lord Jesus Christ in an exceptional way in the time that we have remaining on this earth. Now, not all of us are as old as Matthew here, who is turning 45. Can you believe it? Turning 45, for heaven's sakes.
I don't remember that.
That's in the ancient past. That's for me. But prepare what they think in order that they may prioritize how they live. Exceptional disciples prepare what they think. They arm themselves with a way of thinking. Now, what way of thinking? What way of thinking? And look at verse 1 again. Peter says the same way of thinking. Is that what it says in your Bible? Verse 1, same manner, mind. Let this mind dwell in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, and on and on and on. So he's saying the same way of thinking. That if we want to think rightly, if we want to think highly, if we want to think purely, if we want to think in an exceptional way, that we are to think like Jesus thinks. That makes sense? So let's flesh that out a little bit. And I've given you a number of scriptures in your notes so that you don't have to chase them down, because I'll show them here and we'll look at them. It's purposely choosing to think the following, I think. First, number one, in 1 Peter 3:17, when I suffer in the flesh, for righteousness, that is in fact the will of God. You understand what that's saying? That's saying when you and I have to suffer, and we suffer very little in America yet, but suffer in any way, shape, or form for righteousness' sake, you can know that you're in the will of God. All right? Number 2, when for righteousness I am immersed or baptized or put under or become fully identified in suffering for righteousness' sake, God will help me prevail. We need to know that. That's a promise. Just the way Jesus suffered for righteousness and God caused him to prevail in the resurrection, just the way Noah and his family suffered during the time of the building of the ark and prevailed as God brought them through in salvation. And in the same way, Peter says that when we are baptized, when we are immersed in suffering for doing what is right, God will help us prevail as well. Number 3. Rather than fearing those causing my suffering for righteousness, I will honor Christ as Lord and be ready to explain why I have a hope from the inside out. 1 Peter 3, 14 through 15. I am going to prepare my thinking so that if and when I should suffer for righteousness' sake, for following the Lord, if people ask me, why do you keep following the Lord? Why can you walk through that? Carolyn, I don't want to put you on the spot in any way, but I appreciate the way you're walking with the Lord through this challenge that you have.
Thank you.
And praise God.
And God is keeping me just as calm as a cucumber.
That's right. You're an example of what we're talking about here. So that we have a ready answer for why we can do that. That it is in the Lord. Look, number 4. Suffering for righteousness purifies my commitment to live for the will of God. You know, disciples arm themselves. I don't know of how many of you have a concealed weapon permit or an unconcealed weapon permit or pack iron. In our former church, we had a bunch of FBI agents, at the former church up in Northern Virginia. We had a number of FBI agents and what was the other agency?
Secret Service.
Secret Service. We had a couple of those, and the other one, it's the guns control. Anyway.
ATF.
Yes, thank you. And you probably did too in your churches, but at Calvary Road Baptist.
Yeah.
And so we always felt there were 7 or 8 guys that were packing at any one time, so we felt pretty good. But now, how many of you know Hunter Garrett?
Yeah.
Hunter packs. I don't know if you know that. He comes in the restaurant with this big thing, and actually sort of leans this way. It's so heavy.
30 millimeter, I think.
Yeah. It's a howitzer, I think. He always carries this thing. I don't know if he's ever unbuckled it, but I'm sure maybe he has. But but my point is, they've armed themselves for what potential there might be. And if you can transfer that illustration, that mentally we are being admonished to arm ourselves spiritually to be prepared for that which might come. They arm themselves, they prepare disciples to prepare their minds with key truths and key thoughts which protect us from disorientation and discouragement. You know, if we can keep some of this garbage of this world out of our mind, we don't get as discouraged. We don't get disoriented. Sometimes we'll see something that the world puts forth and we'll say, my goodness, why does that blippity-blip person succeed? You know, and I'm struggling day to day. And or that one seems to go through life without any difficulties at all, while I've got this rambunctious, rebellious kid, or I've got this illness, or I've got this problem with just keeping a job, or the clown sitting next to me got the promotion, and I as a Christian didn't because I'm a Christian. You know, and we can get discouraged and get disoriented, and we can forget the end. And so we need to arm ourselves with the truth of God's word, I think. And Peter, I think clearly, inspired by the Holy Spirit, of course, is big on the way you and I choose to think. And that's where we are right now. And I'm seeing that time is about up, and I'm about to begin the lesson. Yes, ma'am.
I've had people ask me, when this had counsel, different things, like, how do you cope with everything in your life? I don't look at it that way. I look at it, God has been really good to me and blessed me really well. So I think that's one thing, your outlook has a lot to do with how you get through
Oh, absolutely.
things.
You arm yourself beforehand and think about
Exactly.
that. You know, the devil will have us just look at this last instant. And we make a judgment of how God treats us based on what we determine from that last kind of experience, as opposed to looking over the pattern of God's working in our life. And that's why, you know, even that little old song, count your blessings, name them one by one. Have you ever sit down and tried to write out your blessings? Just write out your blessings.
That's way too many.
Way too many. No, that's exactly right. It's way too many. Our oldest daughter has asked me to do something for her. She has bought a little book that says My Dad, and in it is about 40 questions about my life. You know, where did I first live? What was my favorite sport? What kind of tragedies have I had? What has been my biggest experience? You know, all of these kind of 40 or more of those, which I haven't started yet, but I've got them organized to do. And I'm looking forward to doing it if I can get off my my lead. I have a mineral imbalance. Yeah. The lead is shifted. But
To the bottom.
to the bottom. Yeah. I bottom out all the time. I need a bobber. Okay. Just to write down things to remember of how God has blessed us over and over and over and over again. Norm and I have a little thing. You may poo-poo it, and that's quite all right. But we see God's hand in finding pennies. We find pennies on the sidewalk, beside the car, in the shopping centers, everywhere. And for us, it's a little reminder that God is present. And so each time we find one of those little pennies, and we kept them for 1 year. I think it was 200 or 300, you know, over the year. And I went out and bought an ice cream. But thank you, Lord. But just a reminder of God's presence in your life and how He's always available, and seeing God's hand. And if we are not thinking correctly, we don't have that correct input, we'll get disoriented, and we'll pick this up and look at it